Pedro Flores, this is the original yo-yo man. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history because it's important for people that are in yo-yos to understand how it all happened. And people will ask you questions about this. You'll find out, well, who started the first yo-yo? Who did this? Who did this? And it's nice to be able to have some answers. So most people think they know this about Pedro Flores. If you're a player, you might have heard these things. He was a Filipino immigrant. He made a few yo-yos and he trademarked the name yo-yo. Duncan then recognized the potential of the yo-yo as a toy, and he bought the trademark from anywhere from $25,000 to $250,000, depending on the source. And then Duncan popularized the toy, and Flores faded into the history. But now I'm going to tell you the rest of the story about Mr. Flores. Now, first, I'm going to take you back in time. And if we ignore the Greeks and those things that really are bobbins and not yo-yos, what do you think is the first illustration that we have of a yo-yo? What year? What year do you think? Okay, ancient Greek. You need to watch some of my old videos where I dispute those as not. What do you think? Okay, that's the first, I would say, big craze. Actually, it is 1490, Persia. Persian, yes. A lot of people didn't realize that. And they had very cool clothing as well, as besides having yo-yos. Now, I'm not saying that's the earliest yo-yo. It may have been hundreds of years before that. But we do know this is absolutely a yo-yo. Where the Greek stuff, and if you want to talk to me about that, I've got lectures on that, why those were not yo-yos. But anyway, so this has been going on for a long time. Then, as Luke said, we had this big craze around 1792 in France. Everybody was playing yo-yos. All the rich people had yo-yos. It wasn't the kids, it was the adults. It was the Xbox of the 1790s. And then it spread on over to England around the same time. That's what was to be King George IV. They used it in political cartoons, we probably would never seen the toy. And then it went throughout Europe. Here's the old wood print of a toy shop, and you can see the yo-yos hanging there. So yo-yos have been around, but people didn't write about yo-yos. They like to write about wars and sex and royalty and things like that. They didn't write about kids' toys, but they were there. And then here's in Germany, 1860, and they all had kind of different names for the yo-yos. Here's the United States' first yo-yo patent called the whirligig, but what we really called it in the United States and England for hundreds of years was a bandalore right there. And that's a documented bandalore from 1890. And I'll do a shameless plug here. Just came out with a book, The Bandalorist Guide for Collecting Yo-Yo Patches and String Packs. You can see the book down there. And so what is a bandalorist? Well, that is a person who collects yo-yos. So if you have more than 4 or 5 yo-yos, you are a bandalorist. And there's a lot in the room here. Now, so we go in 1914, we go to a dictionary, we look up, what do we see? We see Bandalor and we see quiz, which are the 2 names that yo-yos were called in the English language. But if you look up the word yo-yo, crickets, nothing there. It didn't exist in the English language in 1914. So this is the first I've been able to find the word yo-yo in the English language. It was from the Scientific American. They did a little article on Filipino toys, and they mentioned the toy right there as a yo-yo. So that's the first time we've seen it in U.S. literature. Now this boat here, I actually tracked down what boat Pedro Flores came to America on. That's what he came to America on. In a couple years before that article was published, and this is him in 1913. So, how old was Pedro? Well, we actually don't know because this is his immigration card, which suggests that he was born in 1893, but here's his driver's license card, which says he was born in 1901, and here's his tombstone that says 1896. So we're going actually with the 1893 date because the immigration stuff, they were pretty serious about that stuff. And I don't think the family really knew. Anyway, he ended up at this house in San Francisco where he went to school. He went to high school, and high schools are different then. They learned how to be bookkeepers and clerks and stuff like that. He attended a law school briefly. Again, different from our law school. They had night courses and stuff like that. It was a little more relaxed. But he did have a good education. But he bopped around and did a lot of different things. He was an officer's shipboy, hardware store worker, private residence cook, hospital worker, waiter, clerk, bookkeeper. He kept busy. He did a lot of different jobs, and he got a lot of different exposures. But what happened is he was always kind of that entrepreneurial spirit. And this is a ball on a little elastic cord, and I don't know if that's actually what he saw or if it was actually a paddle ball. But he knew somebody had invented or was selling these type of toys and made a ton of money. And he tried to get all of his Filipino friends to invest with him in doing yo-yos, because he said, if kids are entertained by a ball that just goes up, imagine what we could do with a yo-yo. But they didn't have the vision he did. But he decided to start making yo-yos himself. And if you've seen, think you know what early Flores Yo-Yos look like? This is one of the original ones that he hand carved. He sold these in a jewelry shop of all places, and around the neighborhood the kids buy them too. And he had all kinds of different designs that he would do. And you can see these are from the 20s, from the hairstyles and all that. He painted them himself. And he was also a calligrapher as well. So he made a lot of these yo-yos, and here's a yo-yo that he made, the first jeweled yo-yo. So now we can credit him with making the first jewel yo-yo and kind of introducing the word yo-yo to the United States in a sense. But then he went on and he did convince some people, because he was selling a lot of these handmade yo-yos, to go on and be able to mass produce them. And he made that yo-yo himself. This is an oversized yo-yo about this big. And it was the Yo-Yo Manufacturing Company of Santa Barbara, California. It was actually the Flores Yo-Yo Manufacturing. And there's his little yo-yo manufacturing book that he kept all of his records in. And this is the very first yo-yo off of his run of the mass-produced yo-yos. And they had made notes on there to improve it. And that's what we ended up seeing coming out as the first Flores Yo-Yos in around 1928. Now, what he did then was, of course, brilliant. He trademarked the name yo-yo. But it wasn't yo-yo he trademarked. He trademarked Flores Yo-Yo, because Flores felt yo-yo was anybody's to use. But he trademarked Flores Yo-Yo. And because in 1928 and 1929, it went crazy, because he ran the very first yo-yo contest in 1928 in Santa Barbara, California. And the result was massive. Yo-yos started being sold all over the country. His manufacturing, they had to make a couple different more manufacturing companies to deal with the demand. The contests were all over. The very first yo-yo contests were just pretty much up and down, who could do the longest and things like that. Very basic. But then he, using the slip string and adding that to the yo-yo, we developed other tricks, and he developed contest tricks, so we can actually say Flores developed the first kind of contest tricks. But anyway, it went crazy. These are all from 1928, 1920. Yo-yos were everywhere, and it was the Flores yo-yo that was everywhere, all right? And then it was in 1929, it was making the cover of magazines. There's Santa Claus, and I'm sure a lot of kids had yo-yos under their Christmas tree. So here's the patent application Flores had for the slip string. Some people credit Duncan for that. That's just the loop string so it can sleep. They called it coasting. He devised that. He was the one who thought, and immediately started doing tricks. Now, a lot of people credit Duncan with that. But here's him, before Duncan, trying to patent that. It didn't work, but we know that he tried, because there's the patent application. Which means that he also basically invented the first string packs. So the earliest string packs are Flores string packs, and there's at least to have 5 or 6 different yo-yo string packs by Flores. And all of these string packs, if you happen to have one, they're worth hundreds of dollars. So you can see it, some of them in the book. And then he would do fancy yo-yos. This is one, unfortunately, has no value because the Flores stamp is not on it. But these are, he would paint them in different colors. He would call these fancy yo-yos, some of them, and this may have had a sticker on it that just came off, but unfortunately, we know it's a Flores, but you really don't have any provenance. But then he also had another great idea. And you can't really see it in this picture, but if you look really close, you'll see a little hole right there. You know what that is? First whistling yo-yo, and it's hand-painted by Flores. He told his guys, his partners in this yo-yo manufacturer, I've got a great idea. Let's make whistling yo-yos too. No, that's a stupid idea. We're making too much money selling these wooden yo-yos. We don't want to branch out. You're making it. No, they wouldn't do it. So, but he was also a pretty brilliant guy. He came up with some good phrases like, if it isn't a Flores, it isn't a yo-yo. Do you recognize that from it? Isn't it Duncan? It isn't a yo-yo? Oh, wait a minute. So Duncan didn't invent that. He didn't come up with that phrase. Flores came up with that phrase. It was a big deal in the 20s, and here's his advertising. But you may recognize those characters there because that definitely says Flores Yo-Yo Sales Company. But here's the Duncan. Notice exactly the same images. Not only did Duncan take some of the slogans, but he took the artwork too from Flores. So this is the original Duncan yo-yo. And a lot of people don't realize this, but the very first Duncan yo-yo don't say Duncan on them. It's an oh boy yo-yo, the sensational ever spinning toy. And the problem is, he had a problem with the question on the trademark. So Duncan comes out with the oh boy yo-yo. This is an early Duncan marketing thing. And this is the Little Rascals. The young kids may not recognize, but the older people know this was a famous film series. And so these were superstars back in the day in the 20s. These were superstar kids. Everybody knew their names and all that. Now look at this close up. Flores Yo-Yo Oh Boys. Duncan was having to sell his yo-yos as Flores Yo-Yos. And this is what he did. Now this is colorized, but they just cut out the Duncan boxes and put them over that. And these are the images you will see later when Duncan was advertising all of his yo-yos, and it's in all the books. People didn't even realize that Flores picture even existed. Also, guess who kind of invented the traveling yo-yo demonstrators? Flores! Here it is with Flores. There's all of his Filipino buddies out demonstrating the Flores yo-yo. And guess what? Being a calligrapher, he would carve. He was one of the first. Now, I can't say he was the first person to carve a yo-yo, but we all know about those demonstrators. They all like to carve the yo-yos. And those are worth a lot of money. But Flores was an excellent carver too. So here he is up in the upper right-hand corner there with his white hat, and the contests were going on. So what happened? Okay, so in 1929, yo-yos were going crazy. Flores thought, okay, well, maybe it's just going to be a fad, and I could use the money. So he sold his rights to the yo-yo manufacturing company for $5,000. That's a ton of money nowadays, okay? A ton of money. That's in 1929 dollars. But he kept the rights to be able to sell yo-yos and call them yo-yos. He could just not call them Flores yo-yos unless he was distributing Flores yo-yos. So he lost most of the money in the stock market. You remember the crash then. And he had some bad business, and he loved to party too. He continued to promote and distribute the yo-yos as oh boy Flores yo-yos for Duncan. A lot of times, Duncan doesn't even like to mention Flores, but Flores was one of his, he was kicking butt because he knew how to demonstrate. He knew how to get the crowds in. He knew how to sell the yo-yos. Duncan hired him to run the contest. That's why you see all the Filipinos as early demonstrators. So in 1932, Duncan bought out the Flores Manufacturing Company for $3,500. And Flores got Zero, because he had already sold the rights. So all this business about Duncan bought it from Flores and all that, that's wrong. He bought it from this guy named Lewis, who was one of the partners in Pedro Flores' early companies, and they weren't doing very well. Now, Duncan had what he wanted. He had that Flores, and then he went in and he trademarked the word yo-yo by itself. And that's where he felt he owned it. But that gets into controversy much later when he loses the trademark, because really it was never intended to be trademarked as the word. It was the Flores Yo-Yo that was trademarked. And so this is the contract, if you don't believe me, where the James Lewis is selling this to the Guth, which was the representative for Duncan, for $3,500 in 1932. And this is one of the many ventures. This is an article about Pedro Flores. He invested in this magazine, which didn't do well. But anyway, Flores continued to promote yo-yos for Duncan. And his brother-in-law, Jerry Shunk, also promoted yo-yos with him and was one of the earliest yo-yo Caucasian demonstrators, because most of them were Filipino. And this is an early contest, and if you'll read down there, genuine Flores or Duncan Gold Seal yo-yos. So Duncan early on was still selling Flores yo-yos because that was the name that everybody recognized. They didn't recognize Duncan yo-yos, they recognized Flores yo-yos. And guess what Duncan did? He said, I've heard about that metal yo-yo. I think I'm just going to go out and do it. So he made a Flores metal yo-yo because he owned the trademark. They sold them over in other areas. And then he made, of course, a lot of metal yo-yos in the early 30s. So even though Flores was the one who originally designed it, Duncan is the one who's kind of credited for it. Now, Flores was a very busy guy. He was always working. And so in the early 30s, when he didn't have Duncan yo-yo contest he was promoting, he tried his own company, a Bandalor Company, which goes back to Bandalorist, spelled a little bit differently than we do, but I believe he was with Joe Radovan of the Royal Yo-Yo fame, that they tried to set that up. And then Radovan later left Duncan in the late 30s to set up the Royal Yo-Yo Company. And Flores continued, but we know that he kept on promoting Flores Yo-Yos through Duncan through 1936. And you think, well, that's pretty much the end of Flores. He didn't have much impact on the yo-yo world after that. But actually, he continued to promote yo-yos. That's him with the Duncan yo-yo. And guess what? This is from 1941. In 1938 or 39, they had the Goody Yo-Yo Company start up. Guess who the main promoter for Goody Yo-Yo was? Pedro Flores. I was shocked when I saw this. Oh my God, here's one of the major competitors, if you will, of the Duncan Yo-Yo Company. Who was behind it? Pedro Flores. Now, he wasn't the owner, but he was the guy that was going out and selling the yo-yos and setting up the contest. So this was in the 40s. This is in 1950. So he did this for a decade, at least, with Goody Yo-Yo Company. And then he was also on the side promoting Royal Yo-Yos with his good buddy, Radovan. And then they decided to get together and they created the Flores Yo-Yo Company, because now Flores, the trademark had been lost, the Flores Yo-Yo. The yo-yo was trademarked, and he would put the registration mark on the word yo-yo so Duncan wouldn't sue him. So he continued to promote yo-yos, and he also used as his main demonstrator Linda Sengpiel, who is a Hall of Famer and was known as the Yo-Yo Queen, arguably the best female yo-yo player of the time. So he had an impact all the way through the 50s, producing his own yo-yos, and then at the end, he went selling Royal Yo-Yos. And so just to kind of sum it up, so this is what Pedro Flores did. He founded at least 3 yo-yo companies. He introduced the word yo-yo and trademarked Flores Yo-Yo. He was the first demonstrator and formed the first yo-yo demonstrator teams. He was one of the earliest carvers. He created the catchphrase, if it isn't a Flores, it isn't a yo-yo. He ran the first yo-yo contest, starting the first craze and making it a household name. He tied newspaper subscriptions to yo-yo contests. He introduced the slip string and the string pack. He sold the first jewel yo-yo. He made the first prototype whistling yo-yo. He was the mentor for Linda Sengpiel, the Hall of Famer, and he produced and demonstrated yo-yos for Flores, Duncan, Bandalor, Goody, and Royal his entire life. What an amazing impact this guy had on the world of yo-yos, and yet most people out there don't know that. All they can think of is Duncan. But this guy, if it weren't for him, we wouldn't be sitting in this room today, because we'd all be just playing with a bandalore that went up and down on this string, and that's pretty sad.